Welcome to Asia Pacific Defense Reporter, your go-to source for cutting-edge security insights in the region. Get ready for rapid-fire analysis and commentary from the Asia Pacific with your host, Kim Bergman.
Hello and welcome back. Today we return to some of my favourite themes, Taipan helicopters and AUKUS submarines, and with the mention of Taipans that allude back to Australia's aid for Ukraine, which I believe to be inadequate. But before all of that, I can't completely ignore the Middle East, and I've deliberately refrained from much commentary on the Israel-Palestine situation because I'm not a subject matter expert, and feelings run very strong. But with the situation looking like it's deteriorating further, I thought I'd make a few observations. I made an earlier comment after the Hamas terrorist attack on October the 7th last year, and warned about the consequences of overreaction, using the First World War as an example. A brief recap is that if after the assassination of Archduke Ferdinand in Sarajevo, everyone had reacted calmly, history might have been quite different. However, politicians in several countries, particularly Austria, but also Russia and France, wanted war. The British and the Germans were quite circumspect. It took about a month of behind-the-scenes machinations, which ultimately failed, for war to break out, with the consequent loss of millions of lives, the collapse of empires, the Russian Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and the Ottoman Empire, that irrevocably changed the face of Europe. And some of those changes are still being played out today. I don't have the expertise to analyse all of the current conflict. There's a vast amount of stuff online about this that's far better researched and presented than I can manage. But I'll just make a couple of quick observations. One of them is that current hostilities in the Middle East suit Russia's objectives, especially in Ukraine. I'm not a particular conspiracy theorist, but Russia has leverage with Syria, Iran, and Yemen. And if I were in Moscow, I would be tempted to make as much mischief as possible to distract the United States, again, especially from Ukraine, for practical reasons, and also to hope that somehow a chaotic world will help Donald Trump in the US election campaign. Now, a second and touchier observation is that Israel is no longer the country many of us grew up believing it was. We had, many still have, an idealistic view of Israel as a heroic democracy in the Middle East battling against almost overwhelming odds of survival. Following the Second World War and the Holocaust, there was enormous international sympathy for the Jewish people and the creation of the State of Israel, and indeed, Australia played an important role in that. But demographic changes have now made Israeli society a lot different from what it was in the 1970s. And by the way, this is not just a matter of my opinion. This is actual measurable fact. And there are more extremist religious groups as part of the mix. There is more anger. The country has become more polarized, and some of it has crossed over into fanaticism. This manifests in the belief, this is on the part of some people, a minority, but nevertheless an important minority, who believe in the authenticity of religious texts, that all the land of Israel, which they see as greater Judea and Samaria, belongs exclusively to the Jewish people because it was given to them by God. Now, if you put all of that together, it seems clear to me, and this is a personal observation, and I think it should be clear even to the most fanatical boosters of Israel, above the rights of all other countries and ethnic groups, that there are some members of the current Israeli cabinet who don't want a ceasefire. There are some that want to keep on bombing the Palestinians until what? Until there's no single building left in Gaza? What will they bomb then? Clusters of tents? Just as terrorists don't care how many civilians they kill, in fact, the more the better, if you use a 3,000-pound JDAM to take out a Hamas cell in the basement of an apartment block, there are likely to be horrendous civilian casualties. Now, Some people might recall that in the 1970s and 80s, the UK had a big problem with IRA terrorism. For those of you who are not aware of it, Google it. During that period, there was an attempt on the life of PM Margaret Thatcher. Lord Louis Mountbatten was assassinated. There were bombings in Northern Ireland and England, along with targeted kidnappings and assassinations. Now, I put it to you, if back then I had suggested the only solution was to kill every member of the IRA, people would have looked at me very strangely. If I had further suggested that we needed to start blowing up schools, hospitals, and apartment blocks on the mere reasonable suspicion that IRA members were present, I would have been put in a lunatic asylum. Yet, here we are. On the other side, I'm sure I know there are plenty of people in Hamas and more recently Hezbollah who don't want peace either. There are plenty of fanatics there who want the total destruction of Israel, and especially for those leaders sitting in the comfort of Qatar or Tehran, they couldn't care less about how many of their own people die. It's not a particularly original thought, but I think it's important for Australia's leaders to exercise what little authority they have to urge calm and restraint, particularly on Israel, which still has the most powerful, certainly the most modern and capable military in the Middle East. And this is backed up by at least 200 nuclear warheads stored somewhere in the Negev desert that Israel can deliver by rocket, aircraft and submarine. And by the way, there are probably some extremists in Israel who would enthusiastically support their use, just as I'm sure there are some fanatics in Iran who would support the use of Iranian nuclear weapons if ever they get their hands on them. Now, that's as much as I'm going to say on the topic, but since the word nuclear has come up, let's talk about nuclear-powered submarines, and an interview by ABC journalist Andrew Green, who I know very well, with the head of the Australian Submarine Agency, Vice Admiral Jonathon Mead, which took place last week. It's available online. Now, Andrew has been kind enough to share the full audio with me, which is 10 minutes in length rather than the edited 2 minutes that went to air. And I've previously reported that Vice Admiral Mead told Senate estimates he had met with South Australian Premier Malinauskas 19 times. Now, that has gone up to 25 times. And again, I find myself wondering, what on earth could they possibly be discussing? Premier Malinauskas also appears to have consumed some of the Kool-Aid about nuclear-powered submarines, that when they are built in South Australia, they will transform the national economy and everyone has to get on board and get behind the effort. Well, I'm sorry to say that if they ever do end up being built here, they won't transform the national economy. They will be orphan products. And I observe that people who have never visited a shipyard building nuclear-powered subs, I have, wax lyrical about the amazing technologies involved. Well, no, they're not like that at all. They are big, very secluded, very secure sheds with lots of noise and welding and angle grinders. There are some amazing technologies, but that happens much more in the combat system area, and that is taking place in very quiet laboratories a long way from the shipyard. But getting back to the interview, Andrew asked 3 times in slightly different ways what would happen if the US didn't reach the necessary production rate of 2.33 Virginia-class submarines a year. As regular listeners know, this is something that has always bothered me, and Vice Admiral Mead 3 times avoided giving a direct answer to this very simple question, reverting, as he always does, along with the government, to just simply talking about the tremendous enthusiasm and commitment in the US and the UK to make this happen. Frankly, I don't think that's good enough. And I always ask this same question to the AUKUS boosters and receive the same non-answers, which I find extremely concerning. I can see a few possibilities why Vice Admiral Mead continues to duck the question and why Defence Minister Richard Marles and Defence Industry Minister Pat Conroy do exactly the same thing. The first explanation is he doesn't actually understand the question. And I'm actually becoming increasingly worried that that is what is happening, a kind of cognitive dissonance on display. And I'll circle back to that. The second possibility is he understands the question, but won't answer it because there isn't an answer. No one knows what happens if the US doesn't reach this figure of 2.33 per year, which would be just the most appalling failure of public policy for an undertaking as massive as this one. The third possibility, he knows the answer, but won't say what it is. Maybe there's a secret agreement that if the US doesn't reach 2.33 per year by 2029, Australia will pay an extra $10 billion, and we will receive 2 second-hand submarines that aren't 15 years old, but are 20 years old. Who knows? Who can say? But let's all keep asking the Prime Minister and Richard Marles and Pat Conroy and Vice Admiral Mead. Maybe one day one of them will crack and the Australian people will find out what's going on. And I tell you what, the government wonders why its primary vote is continuing to shrink, and I can assure them it's not all just about the cost of living. It's a more general problem of perceived incompetence, of which the defence portfolio is a part. Now, getting back to Vice Admiral Mead, and yes, this is Pick on Vice Admiral Mead morning, and this issue of possibly not understanding the question of what happens if the Virginia-class submarine production rate doesn't increase sufficiently. I note he was involved in the Type 26 design being chosen for the Hunter-class frigate program, and it was chosen despite being far less mature than the other two ships. That's well documented. Again, that's not just me speculating. However, he and others, including me, by the way, were misled by what I would describe as UK Inc. into believing that they had the best product available, and the whole thing was based on various promises. Yes, this is the most mature design, the Australian-specific changes will be easy, all of that sort of stuff. People fell for it hook, line, and sinker. It's one thing to fool a journalist like me. It's quite another to fool what should have been a very experienced team from the Royal Australian Navy. Now, with this in mind, I'm feeling a certain resonance here with current US support for the delivery of Virginia-class submarines to us. It smacks of, trust us, it will happen, we won't let you down. Personally, I see no evidence of any sort of binding contract between Australia and the US. It's all hot air and all about best intentions. Let's hope I'm wrong on that one. Next, and another favourite of mine, Taipan helicopters and the March 22nd, 2023 ditching in Jervis Bay. As an aside, before I go into the detail, as usual, this topic attracts more anger and irrationality than almost any other I've dealt with. And it's fairly much one-sided anger that goes along the lines that Taipan helicopters are bad and Black Hawk helicopters are good. I find this at times quite childish, and frankly, it reminds me of the idiotic levels of rivalry that used to exist between Holden and Ford lovers back in the days when Australia used to have a domestic car industry. And also, I find that some people in Army, some, not all, I haven't spoken to all 30,000 members of the regular Army, have totally lost their moral compass in this matter and frankly believe it's okay to lie to achieve a particular outcome. And I'll have much more to say about that in the future. Well, not so much total direct lies, but a sort of approach of ducking and weaving to present some facts and not others, to deflect and delay and to downplay or ignore negatives rather than being open and factual about what is taking place. And what is taking place is the replacement of one helicopter capability with another similar capability from the US that is costing us $3 billion for the acquisition, largely on the whim of some very senior, very powerful people in the Army. I know that does sound a bit conspiratorial, but in this case, I believe it's true. regarding the Nara ditching, I feel vindicated because in my previous reporting, because the brief summary is that the defence investigation concluded that after the initial failure of a turbine blade and the loss of an engine, which is survivable, helicopters are designed to fly on one engine and crews are meant to be trained to do so. Anyway, following that, and all of this took place over just a 10-second interval, a number of crew and pilot errors occurred, culminating in one pilot incorrectly switching off the good engine at a height of 9 metres, so the helicopter fell like a brick and hit the water with a force of 9 Gs. I put a fairly detailed piece online about this, and there's lots more to come. Now, the basic point is, yes, there was a problem with the helicopter, but there are a whole lot of other issues involved that went way beyond that. The helicopter, in fact, performed exactly as it was designed to do. It was the human factors that went awry. As I say, more to come in the near future about this. Now, I know I'm galloping along, but let's turn to Ukraine. And a report of the Senate Foreign Affairs, Defence and Trade Committee was tabled last week, which has received no coverage that I'm aware of, that's made a number of important recommendations about how Australia can improve the situation of delivering particularly military aid, but also commercial support to Ukraine. And this includes a number of things, possibly the most important being the appointment of a single person with a lot of authority to coordinate the overall effort, rather than doing things in a haphazard and reactive way with no one in charge and no particular plan, no discernible strategy to figure out the best way of helping, not just in the short term, but in the long term. Now, related to that, as I've mentioned previously, people in army have objected to me and others saying that Taipan helicopters have been destroyed. I have no idea why the touchiness, but for me, this is further evidence of a lack of moral compass manifested in a squabbling over terminology. If people from the Chief of the Army down want to insist they have merely been disassembled, that means that they can be reassembled. Okay, if that's the case, let's reassemble them and give them to Ukraine. Oh, but that's too expensive, I hear you say. Well, in that case, ship all of the parts to Ukraine and let them reassemble the helicopters themselves, and with the support of NATO neighbours, particularly, not touching on the border, but NATO neighbours in the form of Germany and France, who, as I understand it, have previously offered to help. Of course, that's not going to happen, and I will say, of course, the helicopters have been destroyed, and it's a sort of microcosm of a lot of broader problems that this sort of ridiculous insistence that something is not true, when we can see the evidence ourselves that the Taipan fleet will never, ever fly. And another minor correction in the same way, I depressingly note that Foreign Minister Penny Wong has again repeated the untruth that Australia is the largest non-NATO contributor to Ukraine. Well, we are the largest non-NATO contributor if you measure just military equipment, but when it comes to overall donations, Australia has been overtaken by a number of non-NATO members, most particularly Japan and South Korea. The amount of aid that we are delivering as a proportion of GDP, I find, is embarrassingly low. Our politicians don't care. Our Prime Minister doesn't appear to be interested in foreign policy. Our Foreign Minister is interested only in the Asian region. The priority of the two Defence Ministers is something entirely different. Hopefully that will be fixed, but I don't have a lot of confidence. Thank you very much for listening. Goodbye for now, and see you next time.
That's today's Asia-Pacific Defence Reporter. For more in-depth articles, expert opinions and exclusive interviews, visit AsiaPacificDefenceReporter.com. Stay informed, stay ahead. This is your source for all things defence. Until next time.